This is Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing. I'm Rachel Gordon. Here, we aim to make the process of writing and publishing a bit more transparent and a bit less overwhelming. Through conversations with editors and academics at all stages, from full professors to graduate students, independent scholars, and postdocs, we share stories, lessons, and helpful habits from our writing lives. We're really excited to get to speak with Noah Isenberg today, who is a American film scholar and historian. He is currently the Charles Sapp Centennial Professor and former chair of the Department of Radio, Television, Film at the University of Texas at Austin. He's also the executive director of 2 study away programs for undergrads, and he is the author of the Los Angeles Times bestseller, We'll Always Have Casablanca, the life, legend, and afterlife of Hollywood's most beloved film, published by Norton. His other books include Edgar G. Ulmer, A Filmmaker at the Margins, and Billy Wilder on Assignment, Dispatches from Weimar, Berlin, and Interwar Vienna. So thank you, Noah, for being with us today.
Thank you, Rachel, for the invitation. It's good to be here.
So I wanted to ask you first about the 2017 book, We'll Always Have Casablanca. This is a really enjoyable read about this beloved 1942 film classic. And as you write in the introduction, Umberto Eco said, Casablanca is not one movie, it is movies. And this is a book that is clearly not just for scholars or film studies folks. It was published not by an academic press, but by Norton, and it really felt like you wrote it in a way that makes it interesting to any reader, whether someone has seen Casablanca 100 times or never and is only vaguely familiar with it. I'm wondering, though, since you had not published trade press or popular books before, how did you know how to write this kind of book or even how to organize it?
That's a really good question, and thank you for the kind words about the book. I wrote it from the beginning for a popular audience, so I really didn't even have scholars and, to some extent, students in mind. It's funny, I was still teaching at the New School, where I ran their film program, Screen Studies it's called there, and taught a couple of seminars on Casablanca, just sort of test it as we often do in higher ed, to kind of test out the ideas a little bit and get input from students, see how things land. It was always written, though, it went through my agent. I've had an agent here in New York for a good long while. I knew that to write a trade press book, that was going to be necessary. I'm married to a writer and editor. We met when I was contributing pieces of book criticism to the New Republic magazine. She used to be assistant literary editor there. And so I've watched her career. She writes, as a professional and has published a number of trade press books. And so I knew firsthand from from my home life, as well as just from circles, friends here in New York, kind of what goes into something like this. I'd also been writing freelance pieces for the popular press since teaching at Wesleyan. As my first 30 years ago now. It's hard to believe. But when I, fresh out of grad school, started teaching at Wesleyan University up in Middletown, Connecticut, first in the Department of German Studies, and then I kind of migrated to a large extent into film studies. There's a very charismatic film historian and kind of visionary figure when it comes to film studies there, Janine Basinger. And Janine Basinger was also, I think, a really positive influence on me at that time. She'd also written, and in fact, I'll come back to this because, if you write for the popular press, as I was beginning to do already at Wesleyan, and if you write for a popular audience, as Janine Basinger was doing, sort of as a role model of sorts for me, you're bound to take some heat when it comes to your academic colleagues. I would say that in many instances, and I have nothing to lose at this point. I've been in this racket for 30 years. I think I'm just going to say it as it is. I think in many instances, it's probably just spite and envy. Those tend to be next to guilt among the biggest motivators within higher education among scholars. But and in some instances, it's the desire to do what people have, and it takes a lot. It's not something that can happen. It's not just simply a matter of code switching. And so while at Wesleyan, I began writing pieces, as I said. That's how I met my spouse, writing for the New Republic magazine. I was writing for the New York Times a fair amount in the book review, writing for The Nation magazine, writing for Lingua Franca when it still existed, which was fun, and a Dissent, a bunch of other publications like that. And in fact, even at a place like Wesleyan, I remember I came up for tenure they accelerated it. And so I came up a year early, which I was, of course, initially flattered by. But then I learned anecdotally, as one does, especially at a small college, that there were certain members of the campus tenure committee who were concerned about me writing for the popular press. And so when I speak with grad students today, especially those who are interested in potentially pursuing what they call alt-ac careers, alternative academic careers, I couldn't be more encouraging. I think it's a great thing, but I think you want to be mindful of the fact that if you're going to try to do that while at the same time maintaining a toehold in academia, you might find yourself a little bit at cross purposes. And so, yeah, I mean, sorry, this is you opened up a bit of a can of worms here, but the maybe unwittingly, but the Casablanca book was sort of a long time in the making. I just had here at the UTNY Center, I had one of my other major role models and somebody I admire tremendously come speak with students. Her name's Molly Haskell. She's a film critic and writer. She worked early on in her career, bringing sort of French New Wave cinema to New York and to America, and was just pioneering feminist film critic and pioneering film critic in general, writing for The Voice, for The Times, for a bunch of places. And we had a lunch together when I was trying to figure out what to do with the book. She'd published a book very recently, just prior to that, which happened to have been for Yale University Press, which has done a great job. In fact, I have a book under contract there too. I'm to do in their Yale Jewish Live series. I'm to write the Billy Wilder biography. So that's the next project. After I finish this cultural history of Some Like It Hot, which is on the front burner, I've got to get to my last. It'll be my trilogy of Wilder, or as I sometimes called it, and it almost sounds like a kind of slightly naughty Billy Wilder title, which is Wilder Three Ways. Anyway, she had just finished a book on Gone with the Wind called Frankly, My Dear. And it was for what was then still a series at Yale called American Icons. And I thought, oh, maybe Molly will give me insight as to how I pitch something like that to Yale. Maybe that would just be natural. And as academics, of course, I think our reflexes are such, and I don't want to speak for everyone, but I think it's quite common that you initially think of university presses. And I'm the last to say that you shouldn't think of a university press. I think they're wonderful, and I'd love to see us keep them in business. And one of the ways in which we keep them in business, I think, is writing books that actually people read outside of academia. Unfortunately, there were days, years, decades when we were, I think, privileged and were able to just write for a very narrow core group of initiates, of those who were in one's niche field. I think those days, sadly, they are very much in the rearview mirror. And that's, I think, why you've seen a number of not just series, but you've actually seen presses contract and in some cases shut down. And so anyway, that series was no longer in business. And Molly said, look, she was very kind and said, Noah, you know how to write. You definitely try to pitch this for to a trade press. She says, you're going to need an agent. And so I went and met with a number of I'm a undergraduate. My undergraduate work was in history at UPenn, and one of my classmates is an agent here in New York. And so I first went to her and talked with her, and she was great and very, very supportive. But as Molly told me, you should meet with about a handful of agents before you make a decision. And so I did that. And much as I love I'm not going to name names here, but much as I love my classmate, who's a terrifically successful agent, I did the rounds and met with people. And there was a person, her name is Zoe Penamenta. She had been at the Wiley agency early on in her career and then branched out, formed her own agency. In the meantime, she's connected with another agent. It's called Calligraph is the name of the agency now. It's 2 lead agents and a number of junior agents as well. So it's grown. But my conversation with her, we just clicked, as the kids would say these days. I guess we vibed, and she was very receptive. And also one of the things that I think is important for academics who are considering doing this, it's good I think, to have somebody who has an idea or shares your vision for the future. One of the agents I met with, and he's also, again, I won't name names, but who is a very distinguished agent and who was keen on having me sign. So I was very, very flattered. That alone was, for the ego, of course, little ego candy was very nice. But this agent was way, 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 way up in I don't mean to be ageist, but, at that point in time, which is now a good, 15 years ago or so, 10, 15 years ago, I thought I needed a much, much longer runway. And I just didn't know how quickly the ideas would, what the gestation process would be, how quickly I'd get the book out. In the case of Casablanca, I wrote it relatively quickly and I was lucky enough to, sadly, that is no longer going, but secured I was part of the inaugural NEH Public Scholar grantee class. And so that was the last sabbatical I had. That was 2015, 2016. And that enabled me to finish the book quickly. And one of the reasons that I had to do so was it's a trade press book, and trade press books are going to try to, there's got to be a hook. It doesn't have to be, but it helps if there is one. And it was the 75th anniversary. And so you're getting a long-winded response, but one of the ways in which this book really kind of came to fruition is that for the 70th anniversary, so flashback 5 years prior to the book publication, 2012, for the 70th anniversary, I published an op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal through my agent. And so I wrote the piece, and the agent, I remember I sent it to the Times, said it's all over, and there was a guy named Gary Rosen at the Wall Street Journal who was receptive and wanted to publish it. And I said, fantastic, let's do this. And it just unleashed this outpouring of letters and responses, and people were so eager to kind of talk about Casablanca that was served as something of a test balloon. And so, and it was around that time, in fact, I think that I started to give some public. I mentioned a seminar at the New School that hatched the idea for that. And I did a public event at the Center for Jewish History on West 16th Street here in New York. And there too, there was just this huge turnout. People loved this. I had no idea. I mean, I had some idea, but I certainly didn't know until I published that op-ed piece and started to kind of peddle the book idea. And in fact, when the book appeared, and I was lucky enough, again, never imagined this for myself, but was lucky enough to go on a big book tour, something that academics we only dream of. Then I really realized how beloved, which is in the subtitle too. I mean, that was sort of, again, more marketing but I had no idea how much it really matches the truth. I was hoping, of course, but yeah, that was done. The bunch of the book tour was done under the auspices of the Jewish Book Council. And so I went around to a number, and the book is not necessarily, I mean, it's not steeped in sort of Jewish culture, Jewish lore, but it does chronicle, as you know, having read the book, the story of migration and how many emigres, exiles, depending upon your preferred nomenclature and depending upon how these individuals felt about them. Was it temporary, or were they really in a kind of more of a permanent state of exile? At any rate, without getting bogged down in the nomenclature, the book tells the story of these many actors, crew members, writers less so. The writers were American, but who were involved in the production, who fled the Nazi regime, and how much the story of Casablanca really chronicles that very migration. And so the kind of the anchor chapter of the book, called Such Much, which is the elderly Austrian couple that are rehearsing their English for their trip to America. They get in that sort of broken English, the wooden translation, the question of, what watch, such much, in other words, what time is it? But they translate directly from the German, what watch, wie viel Uhr? And it's it's whatever, such much. Anyway, so that became sort of the anchor chapter of the book. And as a result, that's kind of the sort of for the dog and pony show, so to speak, the book tour and taking things on the road. I often would talk about that. There obviously is much, much more. I mean, many people, when you ask them about Casablanca, of course, they think it's one of the greatest romances ever made. And they're much more interested in talking about, Bogey and Bergman than the lecture that I would often give on the road. But beyond that, and that was just, as I said, under the kind of the auspices of the Jewish Book Council, I gave a bunch of talks where we would do, and in fact, may she rest in peace, the late Susan Stamberg, one of the talks was down in D.C. at the Avalon Theater that we were doing for a fundraiser for the theater. And we did a conversation, the great NPR legend, Susan Stamberg. And there we were talking, about all manner of things, Casablanca. So you do a screening and have a conversation, sort of like a talk back. Now, since pretty much every single cast and crew member had long passed, the last of whom was, who plays Yvonne. Now, of course, it's been too long since I've been peddling the book. But the young French woman who plays Yvonne, why can I not for the life of me come up with her name? But anyway, she was the last cast member to pass away. And she passed away just before the book appeared. So rather than having the talk back where you'd have members of the production do a talk back, I was there and did this. And we did this throughout the United States, even did a State Department junket to North Africa, which is fun, introduced screenings in Casablanca and in Tangier and in Rabat. So anyway, that experience, as you can tell, I think from my animated response, was a really impactful one and a very rewarding one in all senses. not just monetarily, but obviously for those of us who are not used to receiving royalties and writing a book that garners an advance and that sort of thing. That is also something to think about for academics who are willing to put in the time. It's not something that is organic for most people, at the very least. I mean, I'd say for the vast majority of people, it is. And again, it's also not simply code switching. It is kind of learning to write. I used to joke, and I still do. I'm about to head to Berkeley next week to give a couple lectures. I did my graduate degree there in '95, and I used to joke that after Berkeley, to a large extent, I had to kind of unlearn the lessons that I learned in graduate school. And there is some. I mean, part of that's meant for whatever comic relief or just a little humorous aside. But there is real truth in that when it comes to learning to write for a popular audience. You can't rely on shorthand, jargon, technical terms. And it's funny, here at UTNY, I have a dear friend of mine, Penn classmate of mine. We met freshman year, and she comes in and gives a lecture to the students. She's done so for the past several semesters. And she speaks of she calls it the grandmother test. Like, can your grandmother understand what you're writing? And I think sadly, my mom passed she was an English teacher. She passed just in July, but she would, she was a great reader, great teacher as well. And often when I wrote, and it turns out I write about this in the book, because Casablanca was her favorite. I mean, she joined the club. Take a number in line, but yeah, it was her favorite movie. And often I would share with her what I was writing too. So I had my in-house editors, as I would sometimes refer to my spouse, and my mom always liked to read, regardless. She would even read the garbled stuff that I wrote when I was still a graduate student. But good mom. Very loyal, very, very willing to put up with all sorts of shenanigans. But anyway, when writing for a large audience, I do think that there are, you almost need to go through a certain training. There's that book by Susan Rabiner.
Yeah, we had her on the podcast, Susan Rabiner,
Yes.
Thinking Like Your Editor. Right, yeah.
Yeah, I think I saw that. Maybe that's why her name was also top of mind. To pivot back to the story of my wonderful, cannot say enough good things about my agent, but Zoe Peñamenta, who's just terrific. One of the things she did when I was writing the Casablanca book was to give me Susan Rabiner's book. I think it's called Writing for Your Editor, if I'm not mistaken, something like that. And it's a really good, no-nonsense, straightforward, direct kind of primer on how to crack the code. I mean, or at least begin to crack it. Whether you successfully crack it or not, there are all sorts of other some factors that are beyond one's control, the market, all those sorts of things. We'll get too deep in the weeds if we go there. But I think that book is really, really valuable. And that's funny. I think I had looked at some of your previous guests, and yeah, she, I think, if I'm not mistaken, she even comes out of academia too. There are a lot of there's a wonderful editor who was for years at Pantheon. I don't know where she's landed in the meantime. Her name is Sarah Burstell, and she was a comp lit PhD. There are great agents who are, lapsed academics, if you will, or whatever you want to call them. I sometimes call myself a bit of not exactly a lapsed academic, but I'm still very much in higher ed, and I'm not going to dispute that. I won't disavow that my origins nor where I currently am. But I do feel that at this moment in time, which is so complicated and so polarized, and just look, not a day goes by we're not feeling some sort of pressure. I feel that we in academia, it's kind of incumbent upon us also to reflect and to rethink what it is that we do. And so, without getting overly abstract about that, I on a much more concrete terms, I think that we can learn to do things that are also more accessible to those outside the academy. Don't get me wrong, there is certainly a place for highly specialized research, highly specialized seminars, labs. I'm not, the two are not mutually exclusive, but I think in particular in the humanities and social sciences, if we don't come around, and I think there has been some movement, and that's why, look, I was so thrilled when in 2015, I think it was, that I got the news of the National Endowment for the Humanities, their Public Scholar Award. I thought, oh my God, I've been vindicated. Like, finally, the NEH has come around and recognized that there's real value in this. Sadly, I mean, that has nothing to do, I think, with NEH's priorities, but rather the higher political regime's priorities. And we won't necessarily go there. But I do think that among many other indicators was pointing towards something of a sea change. And I think that it would serve us well in higher ed. And again, in particular, I can't, with the natural sciences, I'm just not even going to go there because I don't have enough firsthand information and personal experience working in that. My older sister's a neurologist, but I don't, beyond that, I don't have, I'm the black sheep. I didn't go into medicine. But anyway, I think that it's really going to serve us well in the future if we can translate better, if we can, and again, I keep coming back to this notion of code switching, and I don't think that that does justice. I don't think that's what it's about, but it is about maybe more than merely being kind of a code switcher. It's about being bilingual or trilingual. It's about speaking these different languages, and if you need to speak a slightly more rarefied, specialized language with your academic peers, nothing. I'm not. I don't want to be misunderstood here. I'm not suggesting that that is necessarily a bad thing. That's fine. But I think it is incumbent upon us to know how to speak with those outside the hallowed walls of academia. And I think that the Casablanca book is kind of a testament to that for me. And the book on the cultural history of Something Like a Hut, which I'm finally turning a corner on, and I think heading into the home stretch. Keep telling myself that, keep telling my editor that, I'll be there soon. Is also, I'm trying to continue to build on that. I mean, I think that, look, at this point in my life and career, I'll be the first to admit, I don't need to fear reprisals, and I don't need to be paranoid, even suggesting that there could potentially be reprisals for junior faculty who choose to write for a popular audience. But I've experienced firsthand that there can, in fact, even at places that are as progressive as my first, institutional home. At least at that moment in time, maybe things have changed, but I do want to recognize and be mindful of the fact that I'm obviously sitting in a position of relative stability and privilege, and so I feel comfortable writing the way that I do. And I also, I guess, I've reached a certain place in my life where I just don't, people are going to hurl epithets at me or rotten tomatoes or whatever it is they want to hurl. I've got thick skin, and it doesn't faze me. And again, the comeback is, it's just spite and envy anyway. It may be other things too. Look, I'm perfectly willing to subject my work to critical scrutiny. That's fine. But I think that my place at this moment in time, in terms of kind of career trajectory and such, is really much more directed outside academia than it is inside. At least when it comes to writing. When it comes to the administrative work, I'm really enjoying this next phase of my career in kind of academic leadership, and not just chairing a big department, but really kind of program building and developing new programs for undergraduates. I find that enormously rewarding and enjoy it tremendously. But when it comes to writing, I am I'll be quick to admit that I cannot see myself writing strictly for an academic audience. For better or for worse, I just say, look, if people want to say that's a shortcoming on my part, fine, I'll own up to it. But that's not the way I see the remaining years of, let's hope there are many more, but the remaining years of my writing life, so to speak.
The move to Norton that you made reminds me of this fear I know some academics have, which is, if I move to trade, then aren't I without that important check of peer review? And wondered what you thought of that, or what you did.
Oh, I definitely have thoughts on that.
Mm-hmm.
And what I will say is that if one is to make a move like that to Norton or Knopf or Farrar Straus or one of these, distinguished presses that we all aspire to write for. I'm speaking from my vantage point. Those are all presses I respect and would love to have a book appear there. It does not in any way preclude submitting scholarly pieces to journals of learned societies, and where they're subjected to peer, kind of rigorous peer review and all that. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. And what I'll say is, look, even though I do this with maybe no longer with the same regularity as when I was untenured junior faculty, and figuring this is sort of a credentialing process, which, if you're really honest about it, I think it is. And so I needed to have, 3 peer-reviewed journal articles, and I needed to have a university press book, and I needed to, these boxes that one checks on the path towards a successful tenure review. I'm no longer obviously thinking in those terms, but I just want to say, I don't think that the two are mutually exclusive. And there are people, look, I think of, oh boy, who is someone who would come to mind who does both? I mean, I know that Stephen Greenblatt continues to write for. We now share the same because of the merger. We now we're at the same, share the same literary agency too. But there are several academics who are there as well. And I haven't. I have to confess the career that I follow of Stephen Greenblatt are the kind of books that end up getting reviewed in the Times and in the New York Review and other places like that. So but I don't know whether, for years he would write for representations where he was also an editor and was very much involved in a movement within literary theory that still I hold really quite dear, I have to say, even though I'm not a theoretician by any stretch. But new historicism, which really spoke to me. I came out of history. My first degree as an undergraduate was in history. My work was always historically oriented and continues to be historically oriented. So I kind of latched on, and I was at Berkeley, which was the Italians called it La Scuola di Berkeley. That's the way they referred to new historicism. It made sense to me, and I continued to draw on various kind of strands of new historicism in the broadest sense in my work. But what I was going to say about Greenblatt and others, nothing's getting in the way of you contributing the occasional piece to October. I mean, I've written over the years. Also, I co-edited an issue of New German Critique, which is a journal that's published by Duke University Press. I'm on the editorial board of Film Quarterly, which is I always call it a magazine. They call it a journal. It's more of a magazine to my mind. And it's definitely a crossover, Film Quarterly. And that's, University of California Press. So, and look, let me just say here, and it's funny, both my agent and editor laughed about this later because they passed on the Billy Wilder on assignment. But we thought, oh no, this is maybe more niche, maybe more for University Press, but it did really, really well. It has been out, I think, already in 4 separate translations. It was a TLS Book of the Year selected by none other than Tom Stoppard. And sorry, I don't mean to just boast hideously here, but it definitely outperformed, to use a term that they probably would use, the expectations. And so it was great, though, working with Princeton, and I'm thrilled that I worked with Princeton. They're great. I really adore my editor there. She's great. Ann Savarese is her name, and she came out of actually trade. So she went from trade to Princeton. And I think, look, the savvier university presses, and I would kind of toss Princeton and Yale and California and others in that same bucket, they're learning how to do crossover books. And I think that Billy Wilder on assignment is what the reason I say that my agent, because they're like, they're kind of kicking themselves. They actually could have done it at Norton, but at the time they thought, you know what, Noah, just handle this with the University Press, and not in a dismissive manner. They just thought that was the proper home for it. But look, I mean, that Yale Jewish Live series, which was again, it was backed by a hedge fund manager, a guy named Leon Black. So there's a lot of money behind it, and as a result, they're able to offer people very large advances to get them to contribute. So you have a lot of writers, including, so I mentioned Molly, my dear friend and role model. Molly Haskell wrote a book. She's not Jewish and was a little bit concerned about taking it on, but she wrote a wonderful short interpretive biography of Steven Spielberg. So not only was she not Jewish, but she also was not much of a fan of his work. But it's a great book. It's a really great book, and she kind of owns that early on and uses it, I think, to her advantage. And I think writes a wonderful. There are a lot of great books in that series. Adina Hoffman has a great book on Ben Hecht. David Thompson is a big film scholar, has one on Warner Brothers. Really, really terrific. I just reviewed for the American Scholar recently, Ken Turan, who is the former LA Times film critic. He has a book on Louis B. Mayer, and it's a double biography on Louis B. Mayer and Irving Thalberg. They're great books, and look, and I'm honored. And originally, this thing sort of fell in my lap. Originally, it was going to a friend of ours, I won't name her name, but she was overwhelmed. She just couldn't do it. And so I, of course, had to go through the whole process, had to prepare a proposal and all of that. So it's not like it was just literally handed, but I kind of lucked into that one. Now I need to, of course, write the damn book, but there is always that, right? But the point is that those kinds of university presses, and again, kudos to Yale for even doing this series. I think they are trying, maybe not desperately, but very intentionally and deliberately and maybe some desperation is behind it. I don't know, but to reach an audience beyond academe, and so and in doing so. I'll say this is another kind of hat tip to Princeton. I'm not just trying to give, whatever credit to the places where I've had the benefit of publishing my work, but Princeton has also sought non-scholars to write books for them. And I think, look, this is, I don't mean this necessarily as a wake-up call for us academics, but I'm going to call it that because if books are being commissioned to critics and writers, are we suddenly then out of, are we boxed out at the university press?
Yeah.
And the cynic in me would say, oh, yes, and maybe for good reason. If we can't, if we're writing in this opaque manner, then why should they want to publish our work? And why wouldn't they want to publish, the work of the late Janet Malcolm, for instance, who published a lot for university presses,
Mhm.
Wendy Lesser, who's the editor of the Three Penny Review, Berkeley-based magazine, literary magazine, and who's done a number of university press. But why wouldn't they? And so they do, of course. But I think, again, this hopefully ought to cast a few issues into sharp relief, namely that our writing needs to be clear. It needs to be able to communicate ideas in an accessible manner, or we risk, obsolescence in a way. I mean, unintended, obviously, but I wrote, there's a journal that's edited. It's also sort of a crossover journal, no footnotes. Not, it is actually, maybe it is affiliated with the University Press, but Raritan. I think it's based at Rutgers. But anyway, it's a literary journal. And years ago, I wrote a piece. There were just a bunch of theory books that came out around in the early aughts. And I felt that I kind of needed to reckon with that and kind of work it through in a way, almost in like a psychoanalytic way. And so I wrote a piece that was called Theory Out of Bounds, which was the name, by the way, of a Duke University press. No, excuse me, I think it was University of Minnesota. One of the two. They were big theory, big, purveyors of theory and the capital T and the sort of the heyday of theory of the 1980s, 90s, and into the aughts. And it served as an opportunity for me to kind of wrestle with some of those ideas and to kind of stake out a bit of a position without. And again, it wasn't so much writing a screed or a polemic against theory as it was trying to again like grasp it and trying to think it through and trying to also then chart a path not just for me but kind of where the humanities and social sciences might go and I just that was definitely a moment when I was beginning. If I look at it, if I were to kind of refract it through the lens of some, psychoanalysis or something, which I'm not about to do necessarily, but I think it was a reckoning for me as well, trying to kind of figure out where am I going in academia. And I'll add to this too, as I will say this sometimes, like joking refer to myself as a recovering academic. I'm not a recovering academic, but I am to a large extent a recovering German. I began in German studies. In fact, it's funny because I'll go and I'll give a couple talks. One is in Jewish studies next Thursday in Berkeley, and then the following day I'll give a talk in a graduate seminar. I think it's German studies and film studies combination, which makes sense. But I saw in German studies in particular, and I've seen it in other fields too, in the humanities, and I suspect even crossing over into the social sciences, but in the humanities especially, where the discipline has almost written itself into obsolescence, meaning that, and I take German, and I don't mean to take a pot shot at German, but I'll be brutally honest about it because there's no reason not to be, which is that, and this was true of other so-called national languages and literature programs, is that there was such a premium placed on the original language. So in the case of German, obviously on German. And so people would publish in German and in Germany. And again, I don't mean to suggest that that's some sort of an offense, but by doing that, you lose your. I mean, if you're publishing your work in the German language and in journals that are published in Germany or Austria or Switzerland or wherever, you don't have an audience. You certainly don't have an audience here. And if you only have an audience there, then it's a weird relationship. Then if you're teaching in North America, but you're only speaking to folks on the other side of the Atlantic. And so that's just but one example, I think, of how some of these departments, programs, disciplines have in a way backed themselves into a corner.
Mhm.
And it's funny, I was leaving Wesleyan to go to the new school I started in January of 2004. And that fall, I hadn't really published much in these MLA journals or, PMLA or blah, blah, blah.
Mhm.
I was still a card carrying member of the MLA. And I submitted a piece that was called Against Authenticity to Profession, which was one of the many MLA, and they accepted it. And I was going to publish it. And I was so worried that it was going to feel like I'm flipping the bird at my former former field that ultimately I just pulled it. I just thought it was too tendentious. I was somewhat polemical, but again, when I look back, and maybe I just didn't have enough courage to publish at that time. I didn't. It wasn't so much the lack of courage, I think, as it was just the fear that I would unwittingly be insulting some. And that wasn't my intention to insult them necessarily, but it was an effort to kind of again reckon with this self-inflicted, damage that I think we had wrought upon ourselves in a way. Certainly in German and in other fields too, by almost fetishizing the what I was calling the authentic, and it was sort of read through a little, philosophical discourse on authenticity and so forth. It was an MLA publication after all, but I do think that we have had a number of wake up calls, and I'm not suggesting. Look, I don't want this in any way to be misconstrued that I'm kind of pandering to this bizarre and crazy historical moment. We're not at all. I'm not suggesting that people should you know, toe the line or do their work in the service of the current regime or the subsequent regime or even past regime. That's not it at all. But I do think we've learned from various inflection points, various sort of flare-ups over the past, if not handful of years, then even going back maybe decade or longer in sort of not just culture wars, but I don't invest a lot of stock in sort of culture wars debate necessarily, but these debates concerning higher ed, and I think that we definitely have hit a point where we need to do a better job, or else we're just going to invite even more what I think is largely sort of misplaced anger and ire. But I'm kind of saying it. I don't mean to speak out of both sides of my head. I think it's largely misplaced, but I think we bear some of the responsibility.
Mhm. Yeah. I'm thinking about what you mentioned with your Billy Wilder research. It sounds like you managed to do something pretty great with that. It sounds like it's sprouted multiple projects. And I heard one of my academic friends refer to this as fraternal twins. I think actually he was speaking about that in the context of doing two journal articles that are different,
Yeah,
maybe even different disciplines or
yeah.
different kinds of journals. But how did this work for you to get what sounds like maybe more than one book out of him?
Fortuitous. It's not totally arbitrary. So I'll say that for starters. It's not totally arbitrary. It was definitely, there there was forethought and also, I think a drive to kind of carry out some of these ideas. But the ideas congealed at different moments in my career. And so when I was in grad school, again, 30 years ago, even longer, 30 years ago is when I finished. So anyway, in the distant past, I remembered that there were these two collections of Wilder's work that had, again, maybe going back to my polemic against authenticity, but they were only available in German. I read German. German's my other language. I use German all the time, and I love German, and I'm more than happy to speak German. You can write in German. I don't write in German as well as I write in English, but anyway, these two volumes, there was an Austrian as well as a German collection of Billy Wilder's early writings. They were only in German. I thought, this is crazy. He's such a colossal figure here on these shores, and the history of motion pictures and American cultural history and all this. I thought, this is just nuts. So let's do something. And I have a wonderful, she's become a dear friend in the meantime, but translator. At that point in time, I think colleague. We weren't quite super chummy, but we became very tight. It was during the pandemic when we did this project. So we became super tight. We were up, jumping on Zoom calls like this and on the phone a lot. And this is Shelley Frisch, who's a Princeton-based translator, who's also kind of a recovering academic. She had taught for a number of years at Haverford, came out of Columbia, but it's really, and in her case, she's got all sorts of interesting stuff to tell. But look, the stigma that's attached to people who write popular work, look at the stigma attached to the translator. I mean, translators are not, they're the red-haired stepchildren of academia, and undeservedly so. And so I think she kind of, I mean, she could speak for herself, but I think that she migrated out of the academy and into doing translation. She's one of the best translators of her generation for sure, and I think among the greatest living translators at the moment. But anyway, I was lucky enough to be paired with her. In fact, I pitched it to her. She liked the idea, and so we brought it to Princeton. They did it, and so I was already under contract to do, because that the Some Like It Hot. So in a weird way, the Some Like It Hot book kind of spawned this book, but it predates it by decades. So it's hard to describe. And then, as I said, with the Yale Jewish Lives monograph, the interpretive biography of Wilder, which is currently on the back burner, that also then just kind of grew from I guess it became recognized as somebody who works with Billy Wilder and who was a legitimate, Wilder scholar and somebody who could write a also very accessible Wilder biography. Because again, those books are really aimed at a popular audience and not at an academic audience, at least not principally. I think, the academic audience maybe is in the tertiary role. I think it's sort of, popular audience, readers of serious nonfiction, readers of Jewish culture and lore and such, and then like the academic audience, something along those lines. I mean, I'm not speaking on behalf of the press, obviously, or the editors of the series, but I think it was in a weird way kind of a perfect storm. I like this idea of fraternal twins, but I don't know whether I could use it in this in this in this vein. But I don't know. What I will say is this, however. So let me see if I can backpedal a little bit on the fraternal twins idea instead of just dismissing it. Edgar G. Ulmer, Austro-Hungarian-born filmmaker whose life and career I chronicled for the University of California Press, and what began a scholarly study of Edgar G. Ulmer's films and morphed over time. The more I found myself immersed in this fascinating life, and he was kind of inveterate liar, and he would change his dates and his back. He was a kind of fascinating figure. I mean, Lotte Eisner was one of the great writers and critics from the Weimar period and into the post-war period, when she was at the Cinémathèque Française in post-war France, but she began in Weimar Germany. She called him the greatest liar in the history of cinema, and it was absolutely fascinating figure. He began his career together with Wilder. They began in the summer of '29. They worked on this wonderful, just exquisite silent film called People on Sunday. Mention them sometime. And so, in a weird way, so I take back my comment about the fraternal. In a weird way, even though the careers of Wilder and Ulmer are so very, very different, Wilder was really traveled the sort of the depths of underground filmmaking, B pictures, ethnic pictures. It's so very different career, and I really enjoyed writing it. And thankfully, it took a decade later, but UC Press has brought it out in paperback, which is great. So I'm excited that maybe people will be more inclined to discover Ulmer, to read it. So minor plug for the paperback edition, which came out just last year. It was 2024. But anyway, but they began together, and so there is that. I mean, I don't know. I don't know if I have many more books in me, but I wonder if when I reach a certain point, when looking back, I will see all of the either explicit lines or kind of subterraneous lines that there are threads that kind of tie the whole room together. And to use the reference to the Big Lebowski and the dude's rug, I don't know.
Yeah.
Because there are affinities. There's not all of them quite so. Some of them are more muted. Some of them are really strong affinities. And I think in the case of Wilder and Ulmer, when you put it the way that I just did, I think it's pretty strong.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe that was the outgrowth. I did a book for the New York Review of Books Classics as the editor. Introduced Vicky Baum's Grand Hotel, which I love doing, and it was such a treat, and I was so flattered to be asked to do it. Vicky Baum also is sort of from the larger family tree of Wilder, Ulmer, and company. And so I guess in a weird way, even though, as you rightly in your thumbnail sketch introducing me, and again, thank you for that, call me an American. I am an American film scholar. I'm American born, and I work on a lot of American film history, but it all goes back to kind of, interwar Vienna or Weimar, Berlin, or even the late years of the Habsburg Empire for me. And for whatever reason, I just keep on returning. I was joking with a friend the other day. I can't seem to shake Weimar. A friend was visiting, teaches up at Dartmouth, was visiting us over the weekend. I said, "Oh my God, I just can't seem to get out." And I guess I've fallen under the spell to a certain degree.
Yeah, this other part of your work, the administrative work in higher ed,
Yeah.
it seems like maybe it's given you some kind of great freedom. I mean, partly you get to be in New York, which might be especially convenient for your interests and your spouse's
Yeah.
work. Maybe that's part of the benefit of being this kind of director. But how did that seems like proving a whole other set of talents to your higher ups at the university.
I guess so, and I won't. As the kids would say these days, I'm not gonna lie. I'm not gonna lie. It does take a certain toll on one's right. Certainly on just time. Just it's very. These are labor and time intensive roles usually,
Yeah.
and so there's not a lot of spare time for toiling away on one's writing, and which often requires time to meditate, to think it through, solitary work. This tends to be a bit more social, and I like that mix. I enjoy being among other people, and enjoy being in on the kinds of conversations that are held among members of the university's upper leadership and all that. I find that kind of fascinating. But I don't know. I also these are these funny binaries in higher ed that I think often don't apply. Like, oh, if I was talking about the stigma of the translator, the stigma of the person who writes for the popular. There's also, of course, the stigma of the administrator. Maybe also a little spite and envy attached to each and every one, because the
Mhm.
salaries that are commanded if you end up taking on a position of leadership. And look, I'm not going to lie about that either. Yes, there are monetary incentives, no doubt. That would be an idiot not to recognize that, nor to own up and say, yes, of course there is. There are those incentives, but the work is also really rewarding. Being able to help shape a vision of a program or an institution. So I enjoy it. I think that if I'm also being very candid, my editor and my agent probably don't always enjoy it as much as I do, because it does. I'm not able to write as quickly as I'd like to. But I don't know. Both can be done. It's just that they're different rhythms, and they require maybe different sides of your brain. Need to talk to my neurologist sister about that. Get fact checked. Is that right? Is it one left side, one's right side? But it's again, I keep saying that you need to be whatever, bilingual or trilingual. Ambidextrous might be another term. I think you need to be able to hit with your whatever, your right hand and your left hand. Or use your right brain, your left brain, in order to, well, certainly in order to do both. There are other people who I think do one at the exclusion of the other, and that's, respect. That's fine. Okay. So you're going to teach and write and go to faculty meetings and hold admin positions, committee positions. That's your life. Nothing wrong with that.
Mhm.
I've been doing this now for 30 years, which is not, forever, but definitely reached a point where I don't, I'd like to do something different. After a while, it does get a little bit, I love teaching. I love the students. I wouldn't want to lose that part. That for me is like the lifeblood, but I do like being involved in other kind of, again, sort of upper administration, upper leadership type of conversations, and helping to forge, kind of new programs, new initiatives. And I'll say this too, and this is maybe the willingness or the ability to schmooze. I like working with
Mm.
development teams. I like the
Mhm.
fun. I think the fundraising challenge can be really exciting. It can be mind numbing at times, and it can be. And I definitely don't want to be the person who has to make the ask. Then you go over to the development side, which is fine. Look, I respect them, and they're very important. But I'm happy to get prospective donors excited about the kind of work that we're doing, and then the development team can come in and close the deal. That's fine. But I think that too can be very, rewarding in a literal sense, and obviously rewarding in a more metaphorical sense, in terms of just like feeling a sense of accomplishment. Look, I give you just one example, one about which obviously I'm deeply, deeply invested in, and also at least a smidge proud. A lot of the fundraising they're doing is for scholarship support for students, to get them money so that they can come to New York and LA from the University of Texas and spend an impactful semester getting practical experience, doing internship work during the day, taking class in the evening, living for testing the water, seeing do I want to go into the entertainment industry in Los Angeles? Do I want to test out any number of industries here in New York City, from fashion and finance to journalism, media, and so forth? And I really find that deeply rewarding. If I'm helping a student, many first gen Pell Grant recipient students, they're I, they're my favorite. I love to help them because
Mm.
they're the ones who haven't gotten the leg up before. And so, if there's a way to bring them here and change them forever, I'm down with that. And so, the work is enjoyable and I like it. And if it means that I can't write my book as fast as I'd like to, well, those are the trade offs, I guess. Right? Isn't life filled with trade offs?
Yeah, it's actually hard to understand why you would consider yourself a recovering academic. I mean, you seem like you're involved in it in all ways,
Yeah.
in more than many of us are.
Yeah, it's definitely a misplaced appellation. I use it usually when I'm talking with a popular audience, because they wonder why it is that I'm able to talk with them,
Mhm, right.
or why it is that I've written in a way that they actually understand. So that I'll say, "Oh, well, I'm sort of a recovering academic," or it's. You're absolutely right. It's not. It doesn't really hold, does it? No, I'm definitely in. I'm in. I just think that it's more. I think. an evolving academic. It's more for me when I use that term. I think I'm thinking of my old graduate student self. And look, I'll add to this. I think is maybe important. And again, I got nothing to lose. Just at this stage, so I'm going to be very, very frank with you. And I say this to graduate students. I think being a graduate student is perhaps inherently a very insecure sort of mindset. For me, it certainly was, even acutely so. And I often felt I couldn't. I couldn't master the discourse, so to speak. I couldn't write on, postmodernism. I couldn't, it was too elusive. I couldn't get my thumb on it. It made me feel inadequate. It made me feel like an imposter. And so, to a certain degree, finding a niche and a language and an audience that jibed or continues to jibe, actually, that was really revelatory. And so when I joke about being kind of recovered, it's just, recovering. The other joke that I would often tell, and it's not very funny, but that because of the addiction to theory that one developed in the 80s and 90s, I felt like you had to go to a 12-step program. I mean, you really had to you had to be a recovery in that regard. So
Hmm.
recovering theoretician, recovery. Anyway, I agree with you. You are correct. I'm just trying my best to kind of put a finer point on it, I guess, or maybe abandon that term altogether.
There's a question we ask all guests. One is, what is something you wish you had known about writing or publishing earlier in your career?
Oh, I tell you, this is something when I talk with first-time writers, when I'm trying my best to wear sort of my mentoring
Hmm.
hat and speak with junior faculty or trying to get a first book out. One thing I didn't know and should have known is that you really should explore if you can, if you're not under the gun, meaning time, in terms of time and the damn tenure clock and all that other fun stuff. But if you can explore the different options that you have for a project, I think that you will be better off. I think going strictly with the first place that shows an interest
Hmm.
is not, and that's true later on. I'm talking now specifically about authors of first books, but even later too. I think again, it's almost like finding that agent or finding your interlocutor, finding your. It's worth kind of moving around, speed dating, whatever the hell you want to call it, and find the person again. I got a 19-year-old and I have a 15-year-old. So whatever they would vibe, the person you vibe with, the person that you really kind of, and that makes a big difference.
Hmm.
If a university press is sort of just publishing your book because they know you need to get it out for tenure and it's good enough, that's not the same as if you've got an editor who's actually really excited about the project. And going back to your earlier question about like peer review and all that, I wish I could. And this is maybe the cynic in me, but I think it's great that the books are sent out from University Press for peer review. But I don't think it's uniformly strong or valuable. And again,
Hmm.
I don't mean to strike too much of a note of cynicism, but I think that there are different kinds of peer review, and so I definitely wouldn't get hung up on that as an idea. I think that just because it's gone through peer review, it's in any way gotten a more of a stringent edit than you're going to find at a trade house, which is just the opposite. Actually,
Hmm.
it turns
Hmm.
out to be the case where they will go through very, very serious copy editing and all of that, which is sadly I think has kind of been lost at a lot of presses, and in particular university presses.
Yeah, our guests who've gone trade and who are academic have always commented on how much more editing they feel they get with a trade press editor.
Even on the level of line, so line
Yeah,
editing, I think you just don't. I don't think you get that much in that. They don't have a staff for it. They don't have a budget for it.
right.
And even a trade press is often they'll outsource it, but they'll get professional copy editors to do a stringent copy edit. So,
One other question we ask is if there's a writing practice or habit that works for you.
oh, that's a really good question. I wish I were more consistent. I'm just not. I
Mhm.
mean, which is not to say, look, I've been relatively productive and I managed to, I think, churn out some decent stuff. But I don't have. I'm not as much of a creature of habit when it comes to writing as sometimes I wish I were. The German term, Sitzfleisch. You need to
Right.
be able to sit
Yeah.
and stay put. And depending upon how much coffee I've had or how excited I am about something else, my ability to stay put and have that Sitzfleisch is not always so terribly strong. I do find, so just 2 blocks from me, I'm lucky. I'm very happy where I'm seated right now at this moment in time. 2 blocks away is the New York Public Library, and I love to do work in the Rose Reading Room. Not only is it beautiful, you just sort of look up at the ceiling and get lost there, but you can actually focus because everybody else is in the room is doing work. And for me, I have friends who are different. This goes all the way back to the Berkeley days, though. There was the Cookie Lounge, as we called it, in the Townsend Center for the Humanities at Berkeley. A bunch of us would show up with our old laptops. You almost needed to wheel them in because they were so damn heavy back at that. But these were the early laptops. I had an early MacBook or whatever it was. I don't even know whether it was called a MacBook. But in a way, we would joke, we would pace ourselves. And, we'd check in, in the morning, you'd like punch in. I mean, I didn't obviously literally punch in, but we kind of felt that. And that I think can be very, very helpful. Very helpful.
Yeah.
I don't have the luxury of doing that right now. So I just need to squirrel away time when I get it in a way that is harder. And not just it is definitely harder. In many ways, it's harder. But that's just kind of what I'm left with right now. I don't have those long chunks, the big chunks of time that you have when you're dissertating or when you're maybe on sabbatical, or those luxurious moments of splendid isolation and time to think. But I do think that developing those sorts of habits can be very, very helpful to one's productivity. The other thing that, by the way, I'll never forget this. This is still stuck with me. When I was at Berkeley and finishing my PhD, I went to a dissertation workshop, and the person who gave the workshop told me, and this is another one of these things that I tell to graduate students or to junior faculty who are trying to finish up a book. She said, "Look, in a binder, you think the dissertation is going to be, let's say, at that point in time, 250 pages, your average dissertation in the humanities. I mean, look, there were those that were like 800 pages, and the people who'd stuck around Berkeley for 14 years, and you could find them on Telegraph Avenue at the Cafe Mediterranean with the rubber banded filing cards and so forth. Okay, sure, those are those stories, the perennial academic. But 250 pages, put in a binder, and each time you finish a chapter, even a section of a chapter, you take out the blank pages and you put in the text. And it's a weird kind of psychological game, but it shows you that you're making progress. And I found that worked really well. The other thing that I joke with grad students, and it's partly true, but when I was writing the dissertation, one of my friends, he just finished up a dissertation at UCLA, I think it was. Anyway, and said that the best way to write a dissertation, you shouldn't think so much of your dissertation as a dissertation, but rather of a parody of a dissertation. You think of it as a parody of a dissertation, you'll write much, much faster. And I don't want to suggest necessarily that my dissertation that became my first book was a total parody, but it was definitely credential. I'm perfectly happy to talk about it as a credentialing process, and not much more. At least in my case, there are other people who wrote, their dissertation turns out to be this, award-winning piece of scholarship and celebrated and influential and strikes a major resonance in a field changing, all that. That was not the case for me, at least. And so it was more, you got to get the damn thing done. And for writers, that can be really, really hard. It can be crippling. And I'm certainly attuned to that.
Well, thank you, Noah. This has been really helpful and fun. I so appreciate your time.
Oh, Rachel, I appreciate the invitation. This was a pleasure. I'm glad that you reached out to me, as they say these days.
Right.
All these expressions, these overused expressions. Let's circle back, Rachel.
Yes,
I'm going to circle back now. Okay, we'll circle back now. Anyway, thank you so much. It was a real pleasure, and perhaps our paths will cross again.
That would be great. Thanks for listening to Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing, sponsored by the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Florida. Visit our podcast description to find out how to contact us and send us your questions about academic writing and publishing. Follow us on social media at Writing It Pod and subscribe to us so you never miss an episode.